Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive on the Kashmiri Pandit exodus of 1990.
Yeah.
And I've had a chance to read over this academic paper you sent me, and
Yeah.
it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
Yeah.
It's really a story, I think, of immense human suffering and resilience.
And it's one of those events that, we hear about, but I think don't really often get a chance to really dive deep into.
Yeah, it often gets overshadowed in the broader narrative of, global conflicts.
Yeah.
But it's a profound human rights tragedy.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just dates and names in a textbook, right?
Right.
This was a community that was rooped from their homeland. So I think for our listener, it's important to set the scene a little bit.
Sure.
We're talking about the Kashmir Valley in the 1980s.
Right.
A region that's known for its beauty.
Yeah.
But also this long history of political turmoil.
Absolutely. And nestled within this very volatile landscape was the Pandit community.
Right.
A Hindu minority who had called Kashmir home for centuries. And it's crucial to understand they weren't strangers to persecution.
Yeah.
Their history is interwoven with moments of tension and displacement, which really sets the stage for what was to come.
So this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right.
There was a buildup.
It was a buildup.
And the 1980s seemed to be kind of a turning point.
Yeah.
The paper talks about the toppling of Farooq Abdullah's government, the rise of Gosha, and these really controversial 1987 elections that I think a lot of people saw as rigged.
Yeah.
And this really seemed to fan the flames of that separatist sentiment that had been brewing.
Absolutely. It created this power vacuum that was ripe for exploitation.
Yeah.
And that's where groups like the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front,
Okay.
the JKLF, stepped in.
Right.
Their ideology, which blended Kashmiri nationalism with a pro-Pakistan stance,
Right.
really gained traction in this climate.
Okay, so I got this backdrop of instability, rising separatism, and then the JKLF enters the picture with its own agenda. And you can almost feel this tension building. And then we come to January 1990,
Yes.
a date that is just seared into the memory of every Kashmiri Pandit.
Yes.
The paper calls it the night of Exodus, and I think we need to understand why.
Imagine this. You're in your home, and outside the streets are filled with angry mobs. Armed men are roaming around, and from the mosques, terrifying slogans are blaring, urging Pandits to convert to Islam, flee Kashmir, or face death.
It's chilling.
It was a targeted campaign of terror.
Yeah, and when you read the accounts in this paper,
Yes.
you really get a sense of the panic and the fear that gripped this community that night.
Right.
The story of Jirija Tiku,
Yes.
it's absolutely heart-wrenching.
A horrifying story.
She was tricked into returning to the valley after the initial unrest, only to be kidnapped and brutally murdered.
Yes. It's unthinkable.
It's unthinkable.
And tragically, hers was not an isolated case.
Right.
The paper details several instances of targeted killings, like those of Tikalal Taflu, prominent lawyer, and Justice N.K. Ganju. These weren't random acts of violence.
Right.
They were calculated attacks on prominent figures within the Pandit community, really designed to instill terror and break their spirit.
And it worked.
It did.
The paper describes how Pandits, desperate to survive, tried to hide their identity. Some even resorted to wearing their watches on their right wrists,
Right.
which is an Islamic custom.
An Islamic custom just to blend in and avoid being singled out.
That's a powerful image.
It is, isn't it?
It really speaks to the level of fear and desperation that just gripped this community.
Yeah, they were forced to erase their own identity,
Right.
their own traditions,
Right.
just to survive.
And this was a full-blown exodus. The
Yeah.
families fleeing their homes,
Yeah.
carrying only what they could,
Right.
leaving behind generations of history and memories.
Yeah.
It wasn't just leaving homes, it was leaving lives.
It was.
And this exodus wasn't just about displacement, it was about a systematic erasure of their presence in the valley.
Right.
And that's where we really start to see the scope of the human rights violations unfold.
Right.
We're talking murder, torture, rape, forced displacement, destruction of property.
It was a brutal campaign that targeted an entire community based solely on their religion.
Yeah.
On their religion.
And what makes this even more tragic is that there was just this lack of protection from the authorities.
Yeah.
The paper really points to like a really seriously inadequate response from the government, both in terms of preventing the violence, but then also providing aid and shelter to those who were displaced.
Yes.
And it makes you wonder, like, where was the help when these people needed it the most?
It's a question that demands attention.
Yeah.
Because these weren't just isolated incidents.
Yeah.
We're talking about widespread systematic human rights violations.
Yeah.
The paper even connects these events to international human rights laws
Right.
that were just blatantly ignored.
Right.
And it raises this even bigger question of why there wasn't more international intervention or outcry.
It's like the world was turning a blind eye to the suffering of the Pandits.
Yeah.
You know, imagine having to flee your home
Yeah.
with just the clothes on your back.
Yeah.
The Pandit community was thrust into this really bleak and uncertain reality
Absolutely.
in exile.
Right.
And the paper paints a grim picture of life in these makeshift refugee camps.
It does.
Overcrowded, often lacking even the most basic necessities.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about physical displacement.
Right.
It was a complete uprooting of
Yeah.
their lives.
Yeah.
They lost their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of belonging.
Yeah.
Generations of history, culture, and tradition were suddenly severed.
Yeah.
And the paper really highlights the mental and emotional toll this took on the community.
Right.
A trauma that continues to echo through generations.
It's hard to fathom the resilience it must have taken to rebuild
Yeah.
in the face of such immense hardship.
Incredible.
It's like they were forced to start from scratch. Right. And while they did rebuild their lives, the question of justice and the possibility of return remain this constant undercurrent. Absolutely. And that's where the Indian government's response comes into play. Yes. And the paper details a series of steps, taken some positive, others perhaps insufficient.
Right.
On one hand, they established those relief camps, eventually offering housing and job opportunities for displaced Pandits. But the paper also highlights the shortcomings.
Yeah, the conditions in those camps were often dire.
Yeah.
A far cry from a sustainable solution.
Right. And we can't forget those firsthand accounts we read.
Right.
People crammed into inadequate spaces, struggling to make ends meet.
Absolutely.
And then there's this huge issue of accountability for the perpetrators.
Yes.
The paper makes it clear virtually no one has been brought to justice for the crimes committed against the Pandits.
That's right.
And this lack of accountability adds another layer of pain
It does.
to an already open wound.
Absolutely. A wound that festers and prevents true healing and reconciliation.
Yeah.
And then in a move that really sparked intense debate, the Indian government abrogated Articles 370 and 35A of the Constitution.
Okay.
These articles had granted special autonomous status to Jammu and Kashmir, impacting everything from property rights to citizenship.
So how did this integration of Kashmir with India play out for the Pandits?
Well, the paper presents a range of perspectives.
Okay.
Some saw it as a positive step,
Okay.
breaking down legal barriers that had prevented their return.
Okay.
They hoped it would open up opportunities for them to reclaim their lost homes and livelihoods.
Okay.
But many others, and the paper highlights this very clearly, remain deeply skeptical.
Okay.
They argued that true justice requires more than just legal changes.
Yeah.
It demands accountability for the past and concrete guarantees of safety before they could even consider going back.
Yeah.
A law on paper wouldn't erase the trauma and fear
Right.
that had been etched into their collective memory.
It sounds like a deeply complex situation with no easy answers.
It is.
And the domicile law, introduced around the same time, added another layer to this whole debate.
It did.
It essentially redefined who was considered a resident of Jammu and Kashmir,
Right.
with implications for things like government jobs and land ownership.
Exactly. And this, again, sparked division within the Pandit community.
Okay.
Some welcomed it, seeing it as a recognition of their historic ties to the land
Okay.
and a potential pathway for their return.
Okay.
But others remained unconvinced.
Right.
They argued that true belonging went beyond legal definitions.
Right.
They needed to feel safe, secure,
Yeah.
and assured that their community would be protected
Right.
before they could even consider returning.
So even decades later, the question of return remains highly contested,
It does.
with no easy solutions in sight.
Yeah.
And the Pandit Kashmir movement, which advocates for a separate homeland for Pandits within the valley,
Right.
really underscores the depth of this division
It does.
and the longing for a place where they can feel truly safe and secure.
Absolutely. It reflects this ongoing struggle for recognition, justice, and a sense of belonging.
And it brings us to a crucial question. What does the future hold
Yeah.
for the Kashmiri Pandits?
That's the question, isn't it?
The paper doesn't offer any simple answers, but it does highlight some key areas where progress needs to happen.
Absolutely. Accountability is a crucial starting point. As we've discussed, the lack of justice for the perpetrators of the violence is a massive roadblock
Yeah.
to any meaningful reconciliation.
It's difficult to imagine genuine healing without addressing those wrongs of the past.
It is.
And the paper doesn't just focus on internal dynamics, it also brings in the role of the international community.
It does. And this is where I think we as informed citizens have a role to play.
Okay.
We can't let this tragedy be swept under the rug
Right.
by raising awareness about what happened to the Kashmiri Pandits,
Yeah.
by understanding their perspectives and advocating for their rights. We can keep the pressure on governments and international bodies to address this issue.
Right.
It's about amplifying their voices, ensuring their story is heard, and not allowing it to fade into obscurity.
It's about reminding the world that justice delayed is justice denied.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about legal action. It's about fostering empathy and understanding.
It is.
We need to move beyond simplified narratives.
Yes.
And engage with the complexities of this conflict.
Yeah.
Listening to the diverse perspectives within both the Pandit and Kashmiri Muslim communities.
It's about recognizing that shared humanity that binds us all, even amidst the pain and division.
Right.
This isn't about taking sides. It's about seeking a future where all Kashmiris can live together in peace and security.
Yeah.
It might seem like a distant goal,
Yeah.
but it's a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely. So, as we conclude this part of our deep dive, we're left with this thought.
Yeah.
The Kashmiri Pandit exodus is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of hatred and intolerance. It is.
It compels us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge our own biases,
Yeah.
and to actively work towards a world where such tragedies are never repeated.
It's a story that demands our attention, our empathy, and our action.
We'll continue this deep dive in just a moment, exploring what we can learn from this tragedy and how we can all contribute to a more just and peaceful future. So we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into this Kashmiri Pandit exodus.
We have.
We went from the historical context to the horrors of that night in January 1990.
Right.
And now this ongoing search for justice and a path forward.
And amidst all the political complexities and legal debates, what continues to strike me is the sheer human cost of this tragedy.
Yeah.
We've talked about the loss of homes, livelihoods, cultural identity.
Right.
But it's crucial to recognize the deep psychological scars that remain.
Yeah.
The trauma of that experience of
Yeah.
being uprooted, targeted, forced to flee continues to affect generations of Kashmiri Pandits.
It's like a wound that hasn't been allowed to heal properly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to a question that kind of lingers over everything we've discussed. What does the future hold?
Right.
Is there a path
Yeah.
towards genuine healing and reconciliation in Kashmir?
The paper doesn't offer easy answers.
Right.
But it does highlight some crucial areas where progress needs to be made if there's to be any hope of a shared future.
And one of those areas, as we've discussed, is accountability.
Right.
Those responsible for the violence, for the terror that gripped the Pandit community, have yet to face justice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a heavy burden to carry.
Absolutely. It's hard to imagine true reconciliation without some sense of justice being served.
Right.
Without acknowledging the wrongs of the past, the pain and trauma continue to fester, preventing any real healing.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
The paper also talks about the role of the international community in this process.
It does.
And it feels like this issue hasn't gotten the global attention it deserves.
You're right. And that's where I believe we all have a role to play.
By raising awareness about the Kashmiri Pandit exodus,
Yeah.
by understanding their story and advocating for their rights on a global stage, we can help keep the spotlight on this issue.
Right.
We can push governments and international organizations to prioritize justice and reconciliation in Kashmir.
Okay.
It's about amplifying their voices,
Right.
ensuring their story is heard,
Yeah.
and not letting it fade from memory.
It's about saying, we see you, we hear you,
Yes,
and we stand with you.
exactly.
And it's not just about demanding legal action or political solutions.
Brother.
It's also about fostering empathy and understanding.
It is.
We need to go beyond the headlines,
Yes.
engage with the complexities of this conflict,
Yeah.
listening to the diverse perspectives within both the Pandit and Kashmiri Muslim communities.
It's about recognizing the shared humanity that binds us all,
Yeah,
even in the face of profound differences and past grievances.
right.
It's about seeking a future where all Kashmiris can live together in peace and security.
And while that might seem like a distant goal, it's one worth striving for.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay,
I want to leave our listener with this thought.
sure.
The Kashmiri Pandit exodus isn't just a historical event. It's a story that continues to unfold.
Yes.
A story of resilience, a search for justice, and a longing for home.
It is.
And it's a reminder that peace is fragile.
Yes.
That intolerance can have devastating consequences.
Absolutely.
And that we all have a role to play in building a more just and compassionate world.
It's a story that challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to examine our own biases, and to actively work towards a future where such tragedies are never repeated.
Well, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Thank you.
We encourage you to delve deeper into this complex issue, to seek out diverse perspectives, and to use your voice to advocate for understanding and reconciliation.
Remember, even small actions can make a difference. By educating ourselves, engaging in thoughtful dialogue, and supporting organizations working for peace in Kashmir, we can all contribute to a better future for all Kashmiris.